Hello everybody, my name is John Mark Johnson Jr. I'm the host of Relationship and Truth, and I'm trying to get back into putting stuff online. I've never been super fast about that to begin with, but I'm trying to get back into the habit after taking some time off for my health. My health issues are not completely resolved yet. I'm far better than I was, but that's mostly with the aid of medication. Not really doing overly ideal there. Like I said, I'm better than I was, but we still haven't exactly pinned down what my problem is, and medications, we don't really have a good long-term solution for those either, because the medications that I am not on now have some side effects that kind of keep me from doing things I'd like to do. So we're still working on all that, but I am well enough that I can at least do some stuff like this, so I figured I might as well. Today, we're going to be dealing with some stuff that relates to New Testament textual criticism. And without further ado, let's just go ahead and get into it. The first question comes from Anteater23. And Anteater23 says, I think that the proportions photo might be misleading. He's referring to one of my other videos in which I put up a diagram of New Testament manuscripts that divides the categories, showing what proportion of these are Byzantine and what proportion are non-Byzantine. All right. And then, so this person says, I think that the proportions photo might be misleading. With a lot of the early manuscripts, is it not true that they aren't complete enough to tell whether they are Byzantine or not? In that case, why not put these ones in a not sure category as opposed to saying they are non-Byzantine? There is actually a number of reasons for why you wouldn't do that. One of the first and most basic ones is that even if you did, frankly, it wouldn't make much of a difference. What do I mean by that? It is true that there are manuscripts out there that are so small that you really can't classify them according to text type. And for those of you who don't know, text type used to be a major thing for classifying New Testament manuscripts. Are they Alexandrian? Are they Western? Are they Caesarean? Are they Byzantine? That used to be a fairly big thing in textual criticism. However, with CBGM, the coherence-based genealogical method, pretty much all of those except for the Byzantine category has gotten thrown out. And so now the only categories that remain are Byzantine and non-Byzantine. Those are the only categories that really remain because of CBGM. CBGM proved that most of the manuscripts outside of the Byzantine family just aren't related enough to each other to actually constitute a true family. There's not enough connection there to justify calling it a textual family. Or a text tradition. There are families, that's actually a different thing, but a given textual tradition, a text type more properly. So the only true text type that we have is the Byzantine manuscripts. That's the only true text type. We have plenty of others that are not Byzantine, but they are not, there's no subgroups of them that are coherent enough to justify calling them a text type. So those, like I said, are the two categories that we have. Manuscripts are classified as either Byzantine or non-Byzantine now. And it is true that there are some manuscripts that are so small that in and of themselves you couldn't really classify them one way or the other. A good example of this would be P52. P52 is an incredibly small little manuscript that literally just has a few verses on one side and a few verses on the other side. It's literally just a handful of words. There's not a lot to it at all. And if you were stuck with the material that's just on the manuscript itself, yeah, you couldn't classify it as being Byzantine or non-Byzantine, or Byzantine. There's lots of different ways to say it, and I'm not overly picky about how you pronounce vowels, because that changes with time and place all over. But like I said, it's not that big of a deal, because those manuscripts, though, although they do exist, ones that are so small and so fragmentary that you really can't tell much about them, there's relatively few of those. Most of the New Testament manuscripts are at least 200 pages long. It kind of depends on how you define a page and all those kinds of things, but most of them are at least 200 pages long. Granted, most of them are not complete New Testaments, and they're usually not intended to be. Most of the time in history, when scribes would put together, would do their work on transcribing the biblical works, it was usually as sets. So they would work on the Gospel set, they would work on the Pauline Epistle set, so on and so forth. They usually wouldn't view it as a whole, because the whole would be really cumbersome to try to deal with all together, and so that didn't happen very often. But most of them would be of a set, and each set, like I said, usually would have at least 200 pages in it. And that's more than enough to classify most manuscripts, especially with CBGM. Coherence-based genealogical method is a method that utilizes computers and allows us to feed basically every variant that is possible through the computer and see what results it spits out. And the nice thing about this computer application system that we have now for New Testament textual criticism is that it has greatly expanded our basis from which to determine things. It used to be the case that text types were determined with 1,000 indicator passages total. That would be out throughout the New Testament. Of course, your section would only be a subsection of that, but there were 1,000 indicator passages, and the idea was that if your manuscript matches those 1,000 indicator passages in at least 70% of places, it belongs according to this given text type, whatever it happens to be. So it used to be the case that the Byzantine text type would have its 1,000 readings, the Alexandrian text type would have its 1,000 readings, the Western text type would have its 1,000 readings. There were people that advocated for the Caesarean text type. But as I've mentioned, even in other videos, CBGM has basically wiped out all of those. They just don't cohere enough. The only one that there is enough coherence for is the Byzantine text type. And on top of that, in addition to clearing all the other ones off the boards, proving that they're not really as coherent as we thought they were, it has also given us a lot more variations to pull from. Because like I said, it used to be 1,000 indicator passages throughout the entire New Testament that would be compared with, and if in the section that you got in your manuscript you could get at least 70% to match up, that would be enough to classify it. And you'd usually want to take into account sample size. If you could only find 30 relevant variants in your text, that would usually be enough to say that it tends towards the Byzantine or it tends towards the Alexandrian, although the Alexandrian text type doesn't exist anymore, it's not a thing anymore. But that used to be the case. 1,000 indicator passages throughout the entire New Testament, you try to get at least a 70% match in order to classify. And of course, how many you have to match from would determine how strong the correlation is. If it's only about 30 places that you have to look at, that's not overly strong. That would be considered to be a tendency towards this text type, but not statistically significant. So if you could have a couple of hundred, though, out of that 1,000, that would be considered to be stronger and basically enough to say, yeah, it definitely belongs to that category. But with CBGM, we're not stuck with that 1,000 indicator passage method anymore. Instead of having 1,000 indicator passages, now we have thousands upon thousands upon thousands of passages that are in the computer systems, and we can determine with a much greater degree of accuracy whether or not a manuscript holds to a particular text tradition now. As long as you can get at least 30 variant words, you can at least determine the general trend. And most manuscripts are going to have at least 30 variant words. Like I said, the average New Testament manuscript has at least 200 pages. You're definitely going to get at least 30 words in 200 pages. That's not overly difficult. So now our power to determine these things has increased greatly. And like I said, that greater power to actually determine how related these manuscripts are, like I said, has kind of done away with most of the text types that we had before. Now we recognize, the Byzantine is definitely a true text type, but nothing else that we thought was a text type was in fact true, because when we start looking at these thousands and thousands of other passages that we now have computing power for, it turned out that the others really weren't all that coherent. So not a big deal that way, but like I said, we have so many more passages to pull from now, it's very rare that you get a manuscript that isn't big enough to at least give you a general trend. Like I said, as long as you can find at least 30 variant passages in your manuscript compared to the corpus as a whole, you can at least determine the general trend of the manuscript. It might not be a strong trend, but you can at least determine the general trend. But that being said, there are still a few manuscripts that, technically speaking, even by that expanded data set, we still technically don't have enough in order to actually classify them. As I mentioned, P52 would be a great example because, like I said, it's basically a few words on one side and a few words on the other side. You're not going to get 30 variants in, a few dozen words. It just doesn't work that way. It's just not enough to go on. that way. And there are a few manuscripts that are like this, depending on how you count them out, and depending on particular sources you read and whatnot. It's basically somewhere between 4 and 12 manuscripts that we cannot adequately classify one way or the other. And these ones are, of course, usually tend to be the earliest and the most fragmentary ones, but that's it. 4 to 12 manuscripts, and most centuries, except for like the 2nd century, most of the centuries will have 40 plus manuscripts, 100 plus manuscripts. Some of them have hundreds upon hundreds of manuscripts in the later centuries, but that 4 to 12 manuscripts disappears in comparison to the whole pretty quickly. So my first response to that is, why don't we go through and specifically mark the ones that we don't really have a great idea of? Is, first of all, it just wouldn't really change much. 4 to 12 manuscripts that we're not sure about doesn't really change the overall landscape that much. That's the first reason. Second reason is that even though there are some of them that technically we can't determine on their own what their text type is, we can extrapolate from the data that we do have and go from there. P52, for example, is not the only manuscript that we have that comes from the 2nd century. It kind of depends on which source material you use and what theory of dating these things you use, but most people would say there's somewhere between like 3 to maybe as much as a dozen 2nd century manuscripts, and not all of them are as fragmentary as P52. There are others that have quite a bit more material, and so what people would say is, based on everything else that we have from that century, we would say that we would expect P52 to be non-Byzantine, because most of the others from that century are also non-Byzantine. So even though they're not strong enough to say within themselves what they are, because they're very small, you would still be able to tell on the basis of everything that's coming on around them that this general time period seemed to trend in this direction, so it is likely that these particular manuscripts that we cannot classify by themselves also tended in this direction. And so you get that as well. It's not until we actually have evidence that a different text type was in play that we would expect that we would be more cautious about classifying them. That is, if we get to a century where we have extant manuscripts that are definitely Byzantine and definitely non-Byzantine, then when we get to the ones that would be harder to classify, then we could say, well, it really could be either one. However, by that point, most of the manuscripts are long enough and have enough extant material that we can usually classify them just fine. It's usually by about the 4th century that you start seeing definite Byzantine manuscripts show up. Before then, you don't get any definitely Byzantine manuscripts that show up, and so everything before that, on the basis of what you do have for the 2nd and 3rd centuries, and also a good part of the 4th century as well, you would expect that most of them would be non-Byzantine, because the ones that we have from that time period are non-Byzantine. So like I said, first reason why we don't do that is because it really doesn't change anything, because it's only like 4 to 12 manuscripts total. Most of the other ones that would have been harder to classify in the past are not hard to classify anymore, because CBGM has just given us so much more data to work from. So it doesn't really change a whole lot. And then, like I said, there is the principle of extrapolation. That is, you extrapolate from the data that you do have from the germane time period and say, if we don't have evidence that there was another text type that was at play in that century, we're not going to expect anything different from those manuscripts that are too small to classify in and of themselves. We would say, based on the manuscripts that occur with this one in terms of time period, we expect that this would be the case. And that at least gives you a general trend. It's not strong by any means. It's just generally we see that most of them are non-Byzantine, so we expect that to be true of these 4 to 12 as well. So that's basically why. Now, the reason why Anteater 23 is raising this question, I suspect, is because Anteater 23 is probably a proponent of, say, the majority text or the Textus Receptus or the ecclesiastical text position, something along those lines. And those people, even though it's not necessarily consistent with their position, especially the ecclesiastical text people and the TR only people, the Textus Receptus only people, that's what the TR stands for, Textus Receptus, those people tend to have a text type that they prefer that is closer to the majority, if not the majority. Obviously, the majority text people would prefer the majority text. Ecclesiasticals and TR onlys, theirs isn't quite truly the same thing as the majority text, but it tends to be closer to the majority text. And to justify their position, to bolster their position, they like to try to push that text type, that majority text type, that ecclesiastical text type, that TR text type, as far back as they possibly can. And so they want to basically leave room for their text type as early as possible, and that's why they would suggest not classifying these manuscripts that we cannot tell yet. While other people and textual critics in general that adhere to modern textual criticism as it applies to pretty much every other document, whether it be the Quran or Homer or basically any writing from antiquity, they would say always extrapolate on the basis of the data that you do have, and if you have enough data to justify saying that there's a trend here, there's no reason to not extrapolate from that trend. 2nd century is kind of dodgy, just because there's not a ton of manuscripts that come from that time period, but the 3rd century, there's a good number of manuscripts, and then 4th century and onward, it's very, very, very definite. So the only real questionable area is the 2nd century, but like I said, extrapolating from what we do have, it's not overly likely that it's anything else. But like I said, these people don't like to extrapolate from what we do have. They would much rather that we make room for what we don't have. And it's a difference of philosophy. In textual criticism in general, as applies to Homer, Iliad, Odyssey, Tacitus, any ancient work, extrapolating only on the basis of what you do have is considered to be the norm. Leaving room for possibilities that you don't necessarily have any evidence from in that germane time period, that is basically in the realm of conspiracy theories. And not to say that certain conspiracy theories can't be true, they can, but in terms of rigor, until you actually have evidence that tends towards that, not just an absence of evidence, but actual positive evidence that says, yes, definitely this is the case, you can't go there. Now, are there some manuscripts that do have some readings that would be consistent with the majority text or the ecclesiastical text or the Textus Receptus? Yes, you do. But those manuscripts usually only have those in very select places. It's usually a reading here or there, or at most maybe a passage. Something along the line of maybe a few chapters would kind of read that way, but the rest of the book would not. They don't, as a whole, tend towards the Textus Receptus or the ecclesiastical text or the majority text. The majority of those manuscripts that we do have enough evidence to actually draw any conclusions from, for the early manuscripts, they tend in a non-Byzantine direction as a whole. Is it possible that one day we might discover some more manuscripts that are indeed truly Byzantine in the early centuries, especially the 2nd century and the 3rd century? Oh yeah, it's totally possible. And those would still be given data points among the whole, and in and of themselves, probably not going to change a whole lot. Just because it would be just individual data points, and compared to how much data we already have, not likely to change a whole lot, but they are there and they're definitely possible, and it would be very interesting, and they could in fact change a few readings here and there, but as a whole, not really. We just have so much data right now that most readings in whatever system you use, majority or ecclesiastical or Textus Receptus, whatever, they're just not going to be affected in any grand way, even when they're going through a CBGM, which is a radically different method from a lot of the methods that have been used beforehand. They usually still don't change all that much, though. Most of the time, you're talking in a set of books, you're talking about, maybe 30 to 100 changes. Most of them are not going to be translatable. Most of them won't even be noticed by most people because they don't affect very much of the text. You have dealings with particular issues of word order and things like that makes up the bulk of it. And there are definitely some meaningful variants in there, but most of them are like single word variants that get changed. They're not much, like I said, with any of the systems that come into it. But yes, it is fair to say that there are some of them that we can't classify in and of themselves. It's not many. It's like 4 to 12. And in the absence of internal evidence, we would look to the external evidence of what is going on in the same time period and say, do we have any basis from this time period for saying that there was actually a Byzantine text type at this time? And the answer is no, so we're not going to call them Byzantine. Remember, classifying something according to a text type means that you have enough material to actually say that this coheres with all these other things that are of the same text type. And like I said, now the Byzantine text type is the only one that exists. And so that's the only categories you're left with now. There's the Byzantine text type ones, the ones that you do have enough material to say that they cohere, meaning that you got at least 30 variations within the span of text that you had, not 30 words, but 30 variations. It usually takes several words to get to your next variant. So 30 variants oftentimes would be somewhere around 200-ish words at least. A lot of times more, but at least 200 words, which isn't too much. Like I said, most of the manuscripts definitely have at least that much. They can get a general trend going. But if you don't have that much, then the safe thing to do would say that it doesn't belong to that category, and that's where all these others get put. They get put in the non-Byzantine category. Non-Byzantine just says that they don't belong to a distinct text type in and of themselves, and there's a lot of them that are like that. To say Byzantine, non-Byzantine, and not sure doesn't recognize how the classification of non-Byzantine works. Non-Byzantine is for everything that we're not sure about. Everything that we cannot put a specific text type on, because now there's only one text type that's recognized by textual critics. Okay. If we don't have enough material to classify it, we're not going to classify it as Byzantine. So it stays in the non-Byzantine category. Non-Byzantine is the default if you can't say specifically that it is Byzantine. That's the way it works. Like I said, that used to not be the case. We used to have the Alexandrian text type and the Western, and some people fought for the Caesarean text type, but those categories are just no longer relevant. It's, as far as text types are concerned, it's Byzantine or nothing. And so if it's not enough to say that it's Byzantine, it's in the nothing. It's in the non-Byzantine category. All right, and then Dan Murphy says, please explain this. If we seek truth, why are we insistent on using the Greek at all? I'm confused. It was not the spoken language. Thus, it's the first translation. And Dan Murphy, as well as quite a few people, doesn't seem to be overly aware of the history of the region. Koine Greek was introduced to Israel several hundred years before the time of Christ with the conquest of the Greeks under Alexander the Great. The Greeks under Alexander the Great brought their culture and their religious practices, and especially their language with them on their conquests into the east, getting basically into India and all that. There's a huge swath of land that they wound up conquering. And the places that they visited wound up speaking Koine Greek as a matter of course. Koine is the Greek word that means common, basically. It's the common language, the common tongue. And Koine Greek was something that developed as a result of the Greek culture interacting with all these other cultures, especially Semitic type cultures and Middle Eastern type cultures. And what would happen is the Middle Easterners would use the Greek words, because that's what these people who invaded them were using, but a lot of times they used them in very Middle Eastern, very Semitic ways. And one of the things that happened as a result of that is that it became the standard trade language, because all of these groups that were influenced by the Greeks, well, they would trade with each other, and the language that all of them had in common as a result of this trade was Koine Greek. They were all conquered by the Greeks, so everybody wound up picking up a little bit of Greek, and they interacted with each other. And while their local regional languages might be very different, the Koine Greek was common to them all. And so Koine Greek became a very, very, very common thing in the Middle East. By the time that we get to the 1st century, Koine Greek has become so common that 2/3 of the ossuaries, the bone boxes, kind of somewhat similar to a coffin in modern terms, 2/3 of the ossuaries had Koine Greek inscriptions on them rather than Aramaic or Hebrew or anything like that, rather than a Semitic language. 2/3 of them were Koine Greek. What does that tell us? It tells us that in the 1st century, Koine Greek was the most common language that was spoken in Israel at the time. Yes, the religious language was certainly Hebrew, for the Hebrews, of course. Their religious language was Hebrew. Their cultural language was Aramaic. That was something that they picked up in Babylon. So religious language was Hebrew. They wound up learning Aramaic as a result of their exile in Babylon that happened before all of this, even before the Greek conquest had happened. And then by the time of the New Testament time period, you have the expansion of the Roman Empire that happened after the expansion of the Greek Empire. So Latin was the legal language of the land. So you had 4 main languages that were competing at the time that most people would have at least a certain amount of facility with that lived in Israel. For, like I said, religious, Hebrew, cultural, Aramaic, trade language was Koine Greek, and then the legal language was Latin from the Romans. And so when it comes to the New Testament and saying what was original and what isn't, the New Testament was written to be communicated. It was written to be spread around. And so the vast majority of the New Testament works were not written in the language of the Hebrew people themselves, whether that be Hebrew or Aramaic. Most of the New Testament books would not be written for them. It would be written in a language that would allow it to spread across the world. And you have to remember that most of the New Testament works were written from various locations within the Roman Empire. Not all of them were written from Israel. In fact, a lot of them seem to not have been. For example, Paul seemed to have written most of his letters on his missionary journeys, the vast majority of which were outside of Israel. The Gospels, a good many of them seem that they were written outside of Israel as well. So you have, like, say, the Gospel of John being written by the Apostle John when he went to Ephesus. Most likely, Revelation, of course, was written from Patmos. The Gospel of Mark was written by Mark in Rome. The vast majority of these books were not written in Israel. And they were not, and a lot of them were not written specifically to Israelites. Like Paul's writings, for example, they were definitely not, the majority of them at least, not written specifically to Israelites from Israel. They might have been to Israelites that had gone abroad, but they were no longer in Israel anymore. Go to different cities he talks about and going to the synagogues in these different cities that are outside of Israel. They were definitely not people that were confined to Israel. And so most of these documents were originally written in Koine Greek because they were not written just for the people of Israel. They were usually written outside of Israel, and they were written to people who are outside of the nation of Israel. So there's no particular reason to expect them to be written in Hebrew or Aramaic for the vast majority of them. Now, there are a couple of them that historically we have some pretty strong evidence to say that they were written in a language other than Koine Greek. The 2 primary candidates that get mentioned in the historical sources by the early church fathers are the Gospel of Matthew and also the book of Hebrews. That being said, those historical sources also say that those works were very quickly translated into Koine Greek during the time that the 12 apostles, Peter, John, Bartholomew, Matthew, all those guys, they were translated into Koine Greek within the time frame that those guys were still alive. So while the first versions were either in Hebrew or Aramaic of those two primary works, Matthew and Hebrews. They were very quickly translated during the time of the apostles with the oversight of the apostles, and so we know that the translations were deemed to be sufficiently accurate for them. Unfortunately, we did not have any extant Hebrew or Aramaic manuscripts of any of the New Testament works that go back to that early time period. There are some of them that exist. The Syrian Church, for example, still has Aramaic versions of the New Testament. However, those Aramaic versions don't go any earlier than the 4th century in terms of the Moran, which is early, but none of them can be traced any further back than that. The earliest version that we have that we know was still under the oversight of the apostles is the Koine Greek versions. Like I said, we do know that historically that Matthew and the book of Hebrews were most likely written in Hebrew or Aramaic to begin with, but like I said, very quickly translated over. And so those Greek versions wind up being the earliest version that we have that was authorized to go out to the world as a whole. And because they're the earliest version that we have that was authorized to go out to the world as a whole, that becomes our standard because it was the first one that was meant for this purpose of going out and abroad. And had done so under the direction of their Germane people. So, first of all, the people in Israel did not speak Hebrew and Aramaic all that often. Okay, like I said, by the time we get to the 1st century, 2/3 of the ossuaries, the bone boxes, had Koine Greek inscriptions rather than Hebrew or Aramaic inscriptions. So most of the population was speaking Koine Greek as a matter of course. Okay, so even if all the works had been written from Israel to Israelites, to people in the nation of Israel, it still would not have been an odd thing for them to write in Koine Greek. But on top of that, most of the New Testament works were not written from people in Israel to people in Israel. Most of them were written either from people in Israel to people outside of Israel, or from people that were outside of Israel to other people that were outside of Israel, in which case you definitely wouldn't expect Hebrew or Aramaic to show up predominantly. So, yeah. Koine Greek was the standard language of the time, both in Israel and abroad, and especially when you have stuff that's meant to go out into the people, it's going to be in Koine Greek. So yeah, historically, that's what it was. Not really anything super special or fancy about it. It's just a matter of knowing the history and the time. Yeah, that was the first language that they were written in, and there's no great reason to doubt that. That's just how the history panned out. All right, so that tackles the questions for the day from Anteater23 and Dan Murphy. I hope you guys were able to get something out of this. For those of you who are in Christ, I pray that you would go with God and be blessed. For those of you who are not, I pray that you come to know the true Christ of history, the only genuine Savior of mankind. Amen.